Welcome back to MT10 News Vote 2020.
This year's Black Lives Matter protests have been calling for the defunding of the police. But what does that mean? Dr. Ben Stickle is here to discuss the state of policing in America.
And has the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 energized black voters? Dr. Saich Franklin will join us later to clue us in on more.
Plus, Jonas, Saich, and Dr. Ken Blake will show us the latest poll numbers.
All that and more is coming up. MT10 News Vote 2020 starts right now.
Live from Studio One on the campus of Middle Tennessee State University, it's MT10's coverage of the 2020 election.
Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Terica Black.
And I'm Cameron Jackson. Welcome to MT10 News Vote 2020.
Well, it's been 1 hour since polls officially closed here in Tennessee. Our data reporter Jonas Saich joins us now to give us the latest numbers.
Thank you, Terica. And joining me tonight to help with our analysis of these poll numbers is Dr. Ken Blake, a data journalist and professor here at MTSU. Dr. Blake, this is probably going to be one of the most hectic elections, so I really do appreciate your help.
Glad to be here, Jonas. Thanks.
So I want to start with how we're getting to this re-election point, and we're looking at the 2016 election results, and we're seeing some key states here: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All of them went to Trump. Pennsylvania especially was one of the biggest surprises you saw. As of right now, Trump is losing in Pennsylvania and even losing in Ohio and Texas. Dr. Blake, what is the importance of him winning at least one of these key states?
Both of those states are critical to his path to 270, the number of electoral votes needed to win the presidency. But the night is young. We'll have to kind of wait and see how it plays out. Certainly.
The night is young, you're exactly right, and I wanted to take a look at some of the possible scenarios that Donald Trump and Joe Biden would go into, starting specifically with Donald Trump. He needed a couple of certain states in order to win this one. This is a scenario where it's not too much over 270, just a couple over, but you see here Wisconsin, Michigan, both going blue, but Pennsylvania and Ohio would go red. So those are some of the biggest states, and as we've talked about Ohio being a surprise, Dr. Blake, no Republican president has won without winning Ohio. How big of a deal is it to win that state, and can he come back from something like that?
That's true. Ohio has typically been a bellwether in elections. If you don't win Ohio, you don't win, period. So that's certainly one to watch. It's been a hard fought state. Right now, I believe about 53% of the vote in Ohio is counted. And you're absolutely right. Joe Biden is ahead 53 to 45%, according to my numbers right now. Let's remember there are a lot of ballots still to be counted, mail-in ballots and that sort of thing. So Ohio's one to watch. Florida is certainly one to keep an eye on right now. Most of the votes have been counted in Florida, 92%. We haven't called it yet. AP has not called it yet. Texas is another one to keep an eye on. So there are a number of nail-biter counts going on right now.
You mentioned Texas. That is one of the big toss-up states that the Democrats are hoping to snag. One of the possible Biden scenarios is Joe Biden not only winning Florida, but also Texas. You're going to see in this possible scenario, Joe Biden could easily win 300 electoral votes plus, and he would win key states such as Pennsylvania, Florida, even Georgia as well. What are some of the biggest states, and what would he need to grab, the most important state for Joe Biden to grab in order for it to be more of a safer victory rather than coming into the next day or two?
I think all eyes are on Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the prize. We're waiting right now. We have 15% of the vote counted in Pennsylvania. With 15% of the vote counted, Joe Biden is ahead 66% to 33%. That's one to watch. It could change through the night and into tomorrow. We'll have to see.
Yeah, and here's the map for the scenario that Joe Biden would have. This doesn't even have Texas winning for Joe Biden. This has Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, and Georgia. So even if they don't snag Texas, there are plenty of opportunities still available for Joe Biden to really make this almost a landslide. Pennsylvania, you mentioned, Dr. Blake, is going heavily in favor of Joe Biden. It has not been called yet. Ohio as well, one of the biggest surprises of this election. I believe Joe Biden is up by almost 10 percentage points. Also not called. Pennsylvania has over half of theirs reported, while Ohio is around the 15 to 20% for reporting. But yeah, Florida, Texas, Ohio especially is one of the biggest potential wins that Joe Biden could have to make this a lot smoother. But for Tennessee, we know historically all too well, especially this year, hasn't been too favorable for Democrats, and it's been no different so far.
Yeah, that's right. I'm looking at the toss-up states, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas. Of those, Biden is leading currently in North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas, those three. Trump is leading in Florida and Georgia. With, in the case of Florida, 92% of the vote counted by now. Trump's up by 3. That's a nail-biter to watch, for sure.
Yeah, and I want to get to some of those Tennessee elections as well. We know it's been historically red, not much of a surprise as well, not just on the federal level, but also the local level. You're going to see here for Senate District 14 for the state Senate, Reeves is up 76%, Shane Reeves over Chase Clemens, about 25,000 votes, 7,000 votes for Clemens. That should go in favor of Republicans, although I do not believe that has been called just yet. We also have another update going on. Bill Hagerty and Marquita Bradshaw. The 2018 Senate was rather closer than you would expect, with Phil Bredesen only losing to Marsha Blackburn by about 11% of the popular vote. This year, Dr. Blake, not so much the case with Marquita Bradshaw.
Not so much. Bradshaw had, I think, a difficult time getting her name out there. She, I didn't see many ads for Bradshaw here in Middle Tennessee. She's quite well known in West Tennessee, in the Memphis area. I think she had kind of a tough time, kind of breaking out against Bill Hagerty, who is better known.
And usually Tennessee is usually comprised of all Republican except 3 counties. Usually those are the Nashville and Memphis area, no different than it was in 2018. As you see, 540,000 voting for Hagerty, 210 for Marquita Bradshaw. AP, the Associated Press, has already called that in favor of Hagerty. Some of the other races going on, the presidential election update, they have also called Donald Trump to win Tennessee. Not so much of a surprise, 68 to 30.5 in favor of Trump, over 600,000 compared to 287,000 for Joe Biden, alongside some of the other local elections that have been going on. No different surprises as well. You see Scott Desjardins, not officially called yet. They are up by about 63.5%. Opponent Democrat Hale has only gotten 36.4%. So neither the House nor the Senate is going to be flipped with any shocking results. The Republicans are taking control, but it's not Tennessee the Republicans are so much worried about. It's those other battleground states.
Yeah, one difference that I see between 2016 and 2018 and now is Hamilton County. Hamilton County is actually kind of close. It's currently blue on the map. Joe Biden is leading Donald Trump with 65% of the vote counted there. So Hamilton County could end up a red or at least pink. We'll see. But that would be a departure from previous elections. It's typically been Davidson County, Shelby County, where Memphis is, of course, and then Haywood County, which is just a little bit northeast of Shelby County, have been the 3 reliably Democratic counties in the entire state. So maybe Hamilton County is joining that column. We'll see.
And we'll check on later in the night if Hamilton County indeed goes in favor of Biden. Dr. Blake, thank you for so much for joining us. I look forward to the rest of the night talking about where every state goes.
Yep.
The killing of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers set off what is now considered to be one of the largest movements in U.S. history. Facing allegations of police brutality and systemic racism, police departments across the country are facing calls to be defunded. Defunding the police, however, including a variety of meanings depending on who you ask, from complete removal to reallocation of funds. A second Trump term could see an increase in funding and resources to police and penalties for crimes. However, Vice President Biden presents ideas of increasing government oversight on local police departments, and plans to decrease rates of incarceration through crime prevention. After months of protests and clashes with law enforcement, many Americans are wondering what changes can be done to ensure safety for both sides. With us now in studio is Dr. Ben Stickle, an associate professor in MTSU's Department for Criminal Justice Administration. Dr. Stickle, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
To begin, defunding the police has been a hot debate this year, but the term has people confused. What does that mean, and what would it look like specifically for Murfreesboro police officers?
All right, so that's an excellent question that I don't know that I can answer any better than most other people can. It seems that there is a wide variety. Some believe it means fully defunding, as in getting rid of some police departments. Others are looking for cuts. Others it might mean something slightly different. So it's difficult to say exactly what it means. The potential is, when you look at where the funding lies in most agencies, it's usually around 95% to 90% that's really focused on staffing. So any defunding of an agency is going to automatically reduce the number of officers that are there. Another expense that's often taken off the plate when we have situations where there's low funding is training. So my assumption would be, if a department was defunded even a small or somewhat larger percent, that we'd see an immediate decrease in the number of officers and in some of the training that they receive.
So with all the controversies that have been going on in 2020, how do people within law enforcement feel about defunding the police? And what would officers like to see some responsibilities delegated out to other groups?
Well, that's a really good question, and one that I don't think has been asked of many police officers at this point, which is really too bad. It's difficult for me to say what I think that they're feeling. I do know, having served as a police officer myself, there are many duties that society asks police officers to do that they would probably prefer to hand off to somebody else who's more capable or has the correct training or equipment to do that. I think top of the list, and I believe Biden's platform is discussing looking at mental health response. And of course, that's definitely something that needs to be done. And asking the question, is that where we want the police, and when do we want the police to respond to those types of calls? So, tying that in with the question about defunding, trying to understand what we as a society want our police officers to do is a very good question to ask. But I think it needs to be one that's asked before we talk about funding. So if we look at a department and say, maybe we'd prefer to shift responsibilities slightly or altogether for mental health or for security in schools or any number of areas, when we have that answer, then you can look at how we do the funding. My concern is that if we just look at funding only, we're going to end up maybe with negative results because we've not looked at what we want before we've looked at the outcomes.
What policies or initiatives could be implemented to further address the issue of police brutality and to build trust with communities?
So again, this is a very difficult question, and I think part of it goes back to looking at this election as a whole. Obviously, the focus is looking at the presidential election because it's the 4th year, but there are somewhere around 17,000 individual police departments in this country, and the president, whoever it will be, whether it's tonight or next week, has very little control, in all honesty, over most of those agencies. And so building from the bottom up, trying to look at how we can implement some reforms and look at keeping people accountable is really something that needs to be driven by a community rather than necessarily the president. The president certainly has a role to play in leadership and all of that, but looking at what we can do to keep police officers and the community accountable. I will say that you can look at a variety of different circumstances. One of the most recent studies that was released by the Bureau of Justice found that only about 2% of people who had any police contact had any type of force or even the threatened use of force used against them. And about 1.8% of that was during a handcuffing incident. So what we do know is that it's very, very unusual, in all honesty, for there to be force used against people. That doesn't mean that when it's abused or done improperly that it's any less value, but it certainly is important to understand what is it we're actually talking about. What is the force that we think is excessive, and are there other ways to gain compliance? And so we've had some of these talks about de-escalation training, again going back to looking at mental health response, training officers for how to respond to those incidents, and I think some training and some community support in those areas. And again, asking, what do we want our officers to do? Maybe we don't want armed officers in this situation, or maybe we want a different type of response or a co-response. That's been very popular as well. And when we can answer some of those things and look and make sure that we're providing the proper equipment and tools, because we ask officers to do an awful lot. And when we provide for them the resources that they need and the support at the community level, I think you'll eventually start seeing some of the changes that we've been looking for throughout the communities.
So as you stated, we may not know today, it may be next week, but what changes could we see for law enforcement with the election of Biden or under a second term of Trump?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it kind of varies. So each candidate kind of has a focus of what they're looking for in the criminal justice system. And as you've pointed out, that's certainly a very current topic today. And a lot of it because, again, there's very few federal law enforcement officers that the president would have some authority over. A lot of it comes down to funding and directives. And so both candidates have talked about some different avenues that they would like to provide funding in. And those range from, again, looking at mental health response to community-oriented policing, which is the idea that you actually have an officer who's in the community, who's a part of the community, who's seen as an advocate and a help, not necessarily someone just coming in from the outside. And so a lot of times the funding programs that they will set into place will really drive a lot of direction in policing. Where the money is being located and what it's being given to has a lot of impact as it trickles down into local and state law enforcement.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stickle. We really appreciate your insights.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thank you so much. Awareness for racial injustices in America is what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. But with the division in this country, the agenda is becoming harder and harder to push. So, how can we fix this? Racial injustices have become a huge problem for Black Americans.
Like, one of my big things is racial justice. Ever since, pretty much ever since George Floyd was murdered in cold blood, this country has kind of been a hellhole pretty much since then. Constant protests, even things that's going on in Nigeria. It's just constantly Black people all over the world are just continuously being mistreated.
Recently, protests have sparked across the world, raising awareness for the Black Lives Matter movement. But with the country being mostly divided, tensions between two sides cause conflict.
Black Lives Movement is something key because it's something for now, for our generation, our era in time.
Now, in the year 2020, the United States is at its most pivotal time for Americans, election time, where big changes can be made to fix these national and local issues.
When I look at issues, I like to follow precedents. Tennessee has a really bad history with racism. The Klan was founded here like an hour and a half south of Murfreesboro. Murfreesboro itself has a bad history of praising the Confederacy, holding alt-right rallies, things of that nature. So all that combined, in addition to law enforcement harassing Black citizens, it all combines to make Black people just feel uncomfortable in general.
And that combination of issues is growing larger and larger. And while we can't change our horrific history, we can change the now. And that change to stop racial injustices begins with voting.
I am a Black man, so it's not a day that I don't walk outside and kind of fear that this could be my last day on earth, but just simply because I'm a Black man. So.
Throughout the show, we have taken a look at the law enforcement perspective on this year's Black Lives Matter protest and movement. Now we kind of shift the focus on how the Black Lives Matter movement has shaped this election. We turn to Dr. Saich Franklin, author and associate professor in MTSU's Department of Political Science and International Relations. Dr. Franklin, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
To begin, what is at stake for Black Americans in this 2020 election?
Well, broadly speaking, in addition to the conversation about policing, quite a bit is at stake. In terms of the outcome, the status of the Affordable Care Act, when the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare was passed, it helped to reduce racial disparities in healthcare, and African Americans experienced the largest drop in the uninsured population out of any of the 3 or 4 main groups. So it dramatically improved Black folks' access to healthcare. Voting rights is on the table. the voter suppression has become kind of a household name. The voter suppression has been around for a long time. And there's a new voting rights bill that Congress will probably consider. It's been on the table for some time. That's going to really address voting rights issues and help to restore some of the protections that have been removed by the federal courts. Redistricting is important. The role of the Justice Department in safeguarding protections for African Americans and other groups that may be unfairly drawn out of legislative districts, that's also important. Food security is important. When Barack Obama was in office, Michelle Obama instituted what's called the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, addressing food deserts, and also another initiative that addressed hunger, childhood hunger. And those programs are potentially on the table for being cut. And then also a number of regulations that pertain to African Americans are important, from food safety standards to environmental protection standards, environmental justice being an issue that African Americans are concerned about. And then also criminal justice is also on the table too as well. And not just the second chance bill that has been touted by President Trump, but issues such as the federal civil asset forfeiture provision, which was turned back and basically reformed by Trump. Issues such as solitary confinement in federal prisons, issues such as sentencing reform, the role of grand juries in addressing police misconduct. So a number of things on the table for African Americans. And I like to say, I just wrote an article, I like to say that in this election, black votes matter, and so do Black lives.
A lot of things on the table indeed. So with all of this at stake, do you think this year's Black Lives Matter protests have energized Black voters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it galvanized a number of African Americans and non-African Americans in ways that I think would have been quite difficult because some young African Americans in particular were somewhat skeptical of Joe Biden. So yes, it definitely galvanized Black voters, and I think it also offered an extra boost to Black women in particular, who I think are probably the most critical group that's responsible for getting Kamala Harris on the ticket. It's also galvanized white voters who are suspicious or critical of Black Lives Matter. But all in all, we're gonna see what happens, how that plays out tonight.
Thank you. How much could sway an increase in Black voter turnout have on the election?
Black voter turnout matters a great deal in this election. It could influence the outcome definitively for what happens. If you think about Philadelphia and the idea that Pennsylvania is a swing state, if you think about Detroit and Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, Flint, Michigan, those 4 or 5 cities in and of itself, if there's a huge Black voter turnout, that turnout can influence the election. But if you go down south and you look at Atlanta and Atlanta Metro, if you look at Savannah, if you look at places like Albany, Georgia, for the state of Georgia, if Georgia's going to turn blue, then the Black voters are going to essentially be responsible for making that happen. If you go over to North Carolina and you look at cities such as Charlotte, cities such as Raleigh, if you go over even a place like Texas, which no one thought could be even competitive, Black voter turnout in places like Dallas and Houston, will play a huge role. So Black voter turnout is particularly important in this election and in all elections, in part because African Americans are geographically located in swing states that are typically going to determine the outcome of the election.
Yeah, definitely. So with all these things to consider, what could all Americans expect under a second Trump term versus Biden's first term regarding race relations in the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I think under a Trump term, it will be a continuation of the rhetoric that has troubled at least many African Americans. It will be a continuation of the immigration policies that we've seen that has been very critical. That Latinx communities, for example, and Muslim communities have been very critical. I do think that if Trump is elected, the weight of his office will be used to further reduce the impact of the Voting Rights Act, particularly what's known as Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which I think could potentially face a Supreme Court challenge and could get a push by the Solicitor General if under Trump administration. And then some of those critical programs that those policy intervention programs around environmental justice, around the Affordable Care Act, are going to be potentially destabilized or eliminated that are meaningful, I think, to African Americans. And I think if Biden is elected, I do think that you'll get, again, safeguards around voting rights. I think that you're going to get some police accountability initiatives, maybe not the kind of broad interventions that some of the Black Lives Matters folks want, but I do think you'll get some police accountability initiatives. I think the regulations that African Americans care mostly about around environmental protections and food security issues, and labor standards that are critical for African American workers, I think, will be safeguarded under a Biden administration. So this election matters for African Americans in terms of those African Americans who are from low wealth communities and those African Americans who are from communities that are particularly struggling.
Yeah.
And then, of course, finally, I would say that regarding the Trump versus Biden, the coronavirus is extraordinarily important. I mean, we're potentially going to head in the next month or two, we're potentially going to head into a place that's going to worsen as the winter season kicks in. If there's no federal initiative that addresses this heading into next year, then African Americans who in the early stages of the coronavirus were disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. If there's no safety net, no healthcare safety net, no national strategy to address the coronavirus and get a handle on it, then African Americans will be adversely impacted by that.
Definitely a lot at stake here, so we'll just see what happens. But we really appreciate you joining us, Dr. Sekou. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you. Coming up next on the 9 p.m. show, Professor and Political Analysis Kent Seiler talks Tennessee's political history.
Plus, an interview with the former Trump White House intern.
And Jonas, Saich, and Dr. Ken Blake will have an update on the latest poll numbers. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining us. I'm Terica Black.
And I'm Cameron Jackson. While we're off the air, we're going to toss it to Cheddar U. And then we'll see you back at 9 p.m. here on MT10 News Vote 2020.